The sound of gravel under heels cut through the stillness like a warning shot. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee on that first morning at the cabin when I looked up and saw her. A woman in a tailored navy blue suit, blazer sharp as a courtroom dagger, clipboard tucked under one arm like a weapon, marching straight down my driveway like she owned the place. She didn't knock. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't even slow down. Just stood there on my deck with a practiced smile and eyes that flicked over the cabin, the dock, the shoreline, like she was scanning a crime scene. It was surreal. Less than an hour ago, I had been soaking in the peace, the way the lake glowed in the early sun, how the trees whispered like an old friend, and for the first time in 2 decades, how the silence wasn't threatening, but healing. 18 years, 18-hour days, startup failures, venture capital hell, ramen dinners, legal battles, office couches, boardroom betrayals. I'd survived it all, and now I was here, finally. My dream cabin on the edge of Willow Lake, paid in full, no mortgage, no investors, no deadlines, just the sound of bird song and the scent of pine. I had built my software company from scratch and sold it on my terms. All I wanted now was to hear my own heartbeat again. But instead, I heard her. "I'm Laura Kent," she announced, like it should mean something. "President of the Willow Lake Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your property." There was no kindness in her voice, only protocol. Like she was rehearsing a line she'd used 100 times before, and by the looks of her, she had. "We have a certain aesthetic standard to maintain," she said, sweeping her hand toward the water like a judge presenting evidence. "That waterfront section, it's community property." She smiled again, but it wasn't real. It was the kind of smile you wear when you're about to tell someone. "They're trespassing on their own land." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She unrolled a wrinkled hand-drawn map, complete with colored lines and uneven boundaries that looked like a high school group project gone wrong. Her perfectly manicured finger landed squarely on my dock. This was agreed upon by the previous owner. Community access. The shoreline's always been shared. There it was. The lie she'd been rehearsing all morning. I stared at the map, then back at her. Then walked inside, grabbed my property deed, survey documents, and tax records, and laid them out on the table like a royal flush. Red County seals, clearly marked boundaries, GPS coordinates, legal fencing lines. According to every official document, I owned the land. All of it. Right to the water line. She didn't care. Laura barely looked down. Waved her hand like she was swatting away a mosquito. Walker understood the arrangement. He respected what the HOA stood for. She said, voice tight. "We expect our new residents to do the same, Walker." The name hit the air like a fog. Charles Walker, the previous owner. The man whose cabin this once was. The man who, according to the realtor, had passed away unexpectedly and left the property in pristine condition. I hadn't given him much thought until now. But there was something in the way Laura said his name. Possessive, desperate, like she was clinging to a deal that might not have ever existed. Walker left me certain understandings. She continued. He cared about our community. Something about the way her voice cracked on understandings made my skin crawl. I held her gaze. "Do you have anything in writing?" She blinked. Silence. Then her eyes flicked down to the documents again, just for a second before she snapped the clipboard closed. "The HOA board will handle this," she said. You'll learn how things work around here, Mr. Reed. The way she said my name, like it tasted bitter on her tongue. Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking against the gravel like gunshots. But before stepping into her luxury SUV, she looked back at the cabin, not at me, like she expected someone else to appear from inside. She tilted her head slightly, her voice low and cold. I trust you'll be cooperative. That was the moment I knew this wasn't over, and that Walker's story, or whatever it really was, hadn't ended with the sale of this land. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. A violation, red doormat. Not HOA approved. Section 12.4, Aesthetic Conflicts, $50 fine, payable in 10 days. I stared at it in disbelief. It was a doormat, a cheap one I'd picked up because it reminded me of autumn leaves, cheerful, harmless. I laughed. It was so ridiculous. It had to be a mistake, but it wasn't. The following day, grass height violation, $75 fine, then wind chimes, noise pollution, $100 fine. My mailbox was 2 inches too high. My grill cover was the wrong shade of gray. My trash bins were placed 6 minutes too early on collection day. Each notice arrived with increasing urgency, until they were stacked in a binder. I hadn't meant to create, but now carried with me everywhere. This wasn't enforcement. It was a siege. I'd been in boardrooms with venture capitalists who tried to gut my company. I'd been sued by billionaires who wanted to steal my software. But nothing prepared me for the petty tyranny of a power-drunk HOA, president with a grudge and a clipboard. But I wasn't going to fold. I opened a spreadsheet, documented every fine, took time-stamped photos of my property, measured grass height with a ruler, set up GPS coordinates, and then I started walking around the neighborhood, quietly, casually, taking pictures of everything I saw, every non-standard, mailbox, every overgrown bush, every lawn decoration in violation of code. And then I saw her house, Laura's. It was a gold mine of rule violations, oversized political sign in her front yard, unauthorized backyard fence, dog off leash, decorative lights outside of seasonal allowances. She'd built her authority on fear, on other people being too tired or too scared to fight back. But I wasn't scared. I was documenting everything, and I wasn't alone. It was a warm evening when I met Tim, my neighbor, maybe mid-60s, with weathered hands and a nervous glance over his shoulder every time a car passed. He was tending his garden like he was afraid someone might catch him enjoying himself. He looked up when I said hello, and I saw it in his eyes. He knew. I saw her come to your place, he said quietly, same way she did with Walker. There was a heaviness in his voice, something unsaid. Walker was a good man, he continued, but she made his life hell near the end. Constant violations, fines, accusations. He paused. Before he died, he said she'd regret it one day. That he left her a lesson she'd never forget. That stopped me cold. What kind of lesson? Tim didn't answer right away. Just looked past me, toward the lake. He called it his masterpiece. My breath caught. The air suddenly felt heavier. What did he mean? But Tim only shook his head, fear flickering across his face. You'll find out. He turned and walked away, hands trembling as he pulled weeds from the edge of his garden. I stood there, heart pounding, watching the light fade over the water. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I felt like I wasn't alone out here. Someone else had been through this fight, and someone very clever, had left something behind, something that was waiting. The sound of gravel under heels cut through the stillness like a warning shot. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee on that first morning at the cabin when I looked up and saw her. A woman in a tailored navy blue suit, blazer sharp as a courtroom dagger, clipboard tucked under one arm like a weapon, marching straight down my driveway like she owned the place. She didn't knock. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't even slow down. Just stood there on my deck with a practiced smile and eyes that flicked over the cabin, the dock, the shoreline, like she was scanning a crime scene. It was surreal. Less than an hour ago, I had been soaking in the peace, the way the lake glowed in the early sun, how the trees whispered like an old friend, and for the first time in 2 decades, how the silence wasn't threatening, but healing. 18 years, 18-hour days, startup failures, venture capital hell, ramen dinners, legal battles, office couches, boardroom betrayals. I'd survived it all, and now I was here, finally. My dream cabin on the edge of Willow Lake, paid in full, no mortgage, no investors, no deadlines, just the sound of bird song and the scent of pine. I had built my software company from scratch and sold it on my terms. All I wanted now was to hear my own heartbeat again. But instead, I heard her. "I'm Laura Kent," she announced, like it should mean something. "President of the Willow Lake Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your property." There was no kindness in her voice, only protocol. Like she was rehearsing a line she'd used 100 times before, and by the looks of her, she had. "We have a certain aesthetic standard to maintain," she said, sweeping her hand toward the water like a judge presenting evidence. "That waterfront section, it's community property." She smiled again, but it wasn't real. It was the kind of smile you wear when you're about to tell someone. "They're trespassing on their own land." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She unrolled a wrinkled hand-drawn map, complete with colored lines and uneven boundaries that looked like a high school group project gone wrong. Her perfectly manicured finger landed squarely on my dock. This was agreed upon by the previous owner. Community access. The shoreline's always been shared. There it was. The lie she'd been rehearsing all morning. I stared at the map, then back at her. Then walked inside, grabbed my property deed, survey documents, and tax records, and laid them out on the table like a royal flush. Red County seals, clearly marked boundaries, GPS coordinates, legal fencing lines. According to every official document, I owned the land. All of it. Right to the water line. She didn't care. Laura barely looked down. Waved her hand like she was swatting away a mosquito. Walker understood the arrangement. He respected what the HOA stood for. She said, voice tight. "We expect our new residents to do the same, Walker." The name hit the air like a fog. Charles Walker, the previous owner. The man whose cabin this once was. The man who, according to the realtor, had passed away unexpectedly and left the property in pristine condition. I hadn't given him much thought until now. But there was something in the way Laura said his name. Possessive, desperate, like she was clinging to a deal that might not have ever existed. Walker left me certain understandings. She continued. He cared about our community. Something about the way her voice cracked on understandings made my skin crawl. I held her gaze. "Do you have anything in writing?" She blinked. Silence. Then her eyes flicked down to the documents again, just for a second before she snapped the clipboard closed. "The HOA board will handle this," she said. You'll learn how things work around here, Mr. Reed. The way she said my name, like it tasted bitter on her tongue. Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking against the gravel like gunshots. But before stepping into her luxury SUV, she looked back at the cabin, not at me, like she expected someone else to appear from inside. She tilted her head slightly, her voice low and cold. I trust you'll be cooperative. That was the moment I knew this wasn't over, and that Walker's story, or whatever it really was, hadn't ended with the sale of this land. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. A violation, red doormat. Not HOA approved. Section 12.4, Aesthetic Conflicts, $50 fine, payable in 10 days. I stared at it in disbelief. It was a doormat, a cheap one I'd picked up because it reminded me of autumn leaves, cheerful, harmless. I laughed. It was so ridiculous. It had to be a mistake, but it wasn't. The following day, grass height violation, $75 fine, then wind chimes, noise pollution, $100 fine. My mailbox was 2 inches too high. My grill cover was the wrong shade of gray. My trash bins were placed 6 minutes too early on collection day. Each notice arrived with increasing urgency, until they were stacked in a binder. I hadn't meant to create, but now carried with me everywhere. This wasn't enforcement. It was a siege. I'd been in boardrooms with venture capitalists who tried to gut my company. I'd been sued by billionaires who wanted to steal my software. But nothing prepared me for the petty tyranny of a power-drunk HOA, president with a grudge and a clipboard. But I wasn't going to fold. I opened a spreadsheet, documented every fine, took time-stamped photos of my property, measured grass height with a ruler, set up GPS coordinates, and then I started walking around the neighborhood, quietly, casually, taking pictures of everything I saw, every non-standard, mailbox, every overgrown bush, every lawn decoration in violation of code. And then I saw her house, Laura's. It was a gold mine of rule violations, oversized political sign in her front yard, unauthorized backyard fence, dog off leash, decorative lights outside of seasonal allowances. She'd built her authority on fear, on other people being too tired or too scared to fight back. But I wasn't scared. I was documenting everything, and I wasn't alone. It was a warm evening when I met Tim, my neighbor, maybe mid-60s, with weathered hands and a nervous glance over his shoulder every time a car passed. He was tending his garden like he was afraid someone might catch him enjoying himself. He looked up when I said hello, and I saw it in his eyes. He knew. I saw her come to your place, he said quietly, same way she did with Walker. There was a heaviness in his voice, something unsaid. Walker was a good man, he continued, but she made his life hell near the end. Constant violations, fines, accusations. He paused. Before he died, he said she'd regret it one day. That he left her a lesson she'd never forget. That stopped me cold. What kind of lesson? Tim didn't answer right away. Just looked past me, toward the lake. He called it his masterpiece. My breath caught. The air suddenly felt heavier. What did he mean? But Tim only shook his head, fear flickering across his face. You'll find out. He turned and walked away, hands trembling as he pulled weeds from the edge of his garden. I stood there, heart pounding, watching the light fade over the water. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I felt like I wasn't alone out here. Someone else had been through this fight, and someone very clever, had left something behind, something that was waiting. It started with the sound of hammering, a sharp metallic thunk, thunk, thunk echoing through the trees. Far too early in the morning to be a coincidence. I stepped outside with coffee in hand, half expecting the usual stillness, only to freeze. Mid-step, there were trucks on my property and men in hard hats, driving fence posts into the edge of my waterfront. At first I thought I was hallucinating. I walked closer, heart pounding in disbelief. And there she was, Laura, directing the chaos like a film director on a deadline. Clipboard in one hand, a Starbucks cup in the other, gesturing wildly at the contractors while pacing in tight little circles, completely in her element. "Ma'am, this isn't your property," one of the contractors muttered, clearly uncomfortable. Laura's voice cut across the air like a blade. "I'm the HOA president. I am the community. Just get it started. We'll handle legal issues later." Legal issues. Later. I backed up slowly and turned on my phones. Camera. This was no longer harassment. This was invasion. On protected land. Every move they made, every nail, every stake, every word was being recorded. Clara had told me weeks ago to hope for this kind of arrogance. Eventually, she'd said, people like Laura stop hiding their crimes. They start performing them. And she was right. Laura was giving a monologue to her own downfall. The audio was clear. Her explaining to the contractors where the road should go, how long the fencing should stretch, how they could probably pour gravel directly through the shoreline without permits. The contractor kept glancing over his shoulder like he wanted to run. "We need environmental clearance for this," he said finally. "Waterfront regulations are no joke." "I'm handling it," she snapped. "I told you we're within rights. Just build." But they hadn't counted on Charles Walker, or Clara, or me. I stepped inside, grabbed the pre-packed folder Clara had insisted I keep by the front door. Environmental easement documents, violation forms, contact numbers for every relevant office, and began making calls. It was like launching a precision airstrike. Call 1, Clara. Immediate escalation. To environmental enforcement, call 2, county building inspector, code red flag, call 3, sheriff's office. Property trespass and destruction of protected land. By the time the fence posts were halfway in, the first county vehicle rolled onto my driveway. Then another, and another. A white truck with the seal of the Department of Environmental Protection. The look on Laura's face when she saw those logos was art. She straightened up instantly, trying to flash the confident smile she always wore, but it twitched, like something fragile held together by willpower and caffeine. I walked out slowly, camera still rolling. Clara arrived next, stepping out of her car like a prosecutor walking into closing arguments. She didn't even pause before addressing Laura directly. "Mrs. Kent, you're in direct violation of a federal conservation easement. This land is protected by environmental law. You've destroyed property on restricted ground, and you've done so publicly with no permits." Every head turned. Neighbors had started gathering now, drawn by the commotion, the county vehicles, the unmistakable scent of HOA drama boiling over in daylight. They stood in clusters along the sidewalk, murmuring, whispering, filming. The sheriff's deputy asked for IDs. The building inspector began measuring fence posts. The county surveyor unpacked GPS equipment to verify the property lines. Every inch Laura had tried to take was documented, measured, marked. Laura's voice cracked as she tried to regain control. "I didn't know. This was approved. The board." "You trespassed," Clara said. on protected land. You gave orders to contractors to destroy property, and you tried to bypass environmental law to benefit your brother's development project. The crowd gasped. Someone whispered, "Wait, this is about money?" The contractors had stopped working the moment the sheriff arrived. Now they were standing awkwardly near their trucks, arms crossed, clearly regretting everything. One of them, a guy in a neon vest with Cutter Bros Contracting on his back, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, we're gonna need immediate payment for lost time. And we're not touching another thing until this is cleared up legally." Laura looked cornered, trapped, exactly where Walker had wanted her. She turned to me, eyes sharp with desperation. "You don't know what you're interfering with, Reed. This isn't just about you." "No," I said. "It's about everyone." And then Clara handed me the letter, a community-wide memo, detailed, precise, with photos of the fence posts, video stills from Laura's illegal orders, environmental documents, permit rejection letters tied to Kent Brothers Construction, a timeline of her campaign, from the moment I moved in to the moment she drove those posts into federal land. We didn't just build a case. We told a story. That afternoon, we mailed a copy to every house in Willow Lake. The HOA board received theirs by hand, placed directly on their porches, just in time for the evening news. Because yes, a local station had picked up the story. A corrupt HOA president caught building illegally on protected land to benefit her family's secret development deal. That was primetime gold. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my doorbell. Tim was there, shaking slightly, holding a newspaper. "Front page," he said quietly. There she was, Laura Kent, in full color, standing beside an illegally installed fence post, sheriff deputy in the background, jaw clenched, face pale. The headline, "HOA president accused of land grab on protected lakefront." It was over. Not legally, not yet, but her power, her grip, her reign, broken. That same day, Clara received a call from a former board member. He wanted to meet, said he had something to show us, something he'd been too scared to reveal before. We met in a diner just outside the community limits. He pulled out a file, photocopies of internal HOA memos, dating back years. Laura had been collecting complaints about Charles Walker, flagging his property for future assessment, even discussing possible repurposing plans for community use after his death. She was planning this for a long time, the man said. Even before Walker passed. "Why?" I asked. He leaned in closer. She thought Walker promised her access to the lake, said it was meant for everyone, but there's no document, no will clause, nothing, just her word. That night, I sat on my deck, staring out at the lake. The fence posts had been removed. The contractors were gone. The board was silent. The wind rippled across the water gently, like a whisper only I could hear. And somewhere, in the spaces between the wind, I heard it again, a laugh, soft, knowing Charles Walker, the man who saw this all coming, who orchestrated it from beyond the grave like a master strategist watching his final act unfold exactly as written. Clara joined me on the deck with 2 beers. "You realize this isn't over, right?" she said quietly. "There's still more to come." I nodded, because I could feel it too. This wasn't just a story of power abused or land defended. It was a game, and Walker had only just moved the queen. The first real crack in her empire came from the quietest voice in the room. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't an arrest. It was Mrs. Patterson, 78 years old, spine curved like the willow trees out front, voice soft as breath, who stood up in the middle of the emergency HOA meeting and said, "I motion to remove Laura Kent as HOA president. No shouting, no anger. Just a tired woman who had been bullied long enough. And that's when everything changed. The meeting was supposed to be Laura's last chance to salvage control. She'd called it herself, probably thinking she could spin the media blowback, claim misunderstanding, remind everyone of her years of service to the community. But the community had shown up. They filled every chair, lined the walls, crowded into the back, standing shoulder to shoulder. You could feel the tension in the air, years of frustration packed into one room like gunpowder waiting for a spark, and that spark had a name. Laura Kent walked in 20 minutes late wearing her trademark blazer, but she looked different. Her hair was pulled back tight, but messy. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion. She clutched her clipboard like a weapon she wasn't sure would work anymore. There were no polite greetings, no fake smiles. She cleared her throat at the front of the room and began with a script. Friends, neighbors. I understand emotions are high right now, but I assure you, the actions taken regarding the lakefront were in the best interest of this community's long-term vision. She said community like it was a shield. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Someone from the back shouted, "Then why was your brother's name on the permits?" Laura flinched. A murmur rippled through the room like a wave crashing into seawalls. Another voice. "How long have you been planning to steal his land?" And then came the motion from Mrs. Patterson. The room froze. Laura's jaw twitched. "This meeting isn't about my position," she snapped. "It's about the vote is valid," said a board member. "She has the right to make the motion." Laura's eyes narrowed. Her gaze snapped to the man speaking, Greg, her longtime ally on the board. But even he looked away. Then came the second. Dozens of voices, almost simultaneously, seconded. The vote was no longer just symbolic. It was unstoppable. Sat near the front, hands clasped in my lap, the binder of documents still resting beside me, but I didn't need it. Everyone had already seen the truth. Someone had printed copies of the letter Clara and I had sent to every household, and they were being passed from row to row like contraband. Photos of the illegal fence, screenshots of Laura giving orders. Permit maps tied to Kent Brothers construction. HOA fines against harmless families. Handwritten notes with dates and signatures. Proof. All of it. The board took the vote, 23-1. Only Laura voted for herself. She stood in stunned silence, breathing through her nose like someone trying not to cry. "You people don't understand what you're doing," she hissed. "Charles Walker promised me access to that land. He told me it would be ours." The room fell quiet. Not because they believed her, but because everyone realized she still believed herself. That was the real tragedy. Laura Kent wasn't just corrupt, she was delusional. A tyrant with a martyr complex, convinced the system she abused had owed her something all along. But now the system was pushing back. Clara stood to speak, calm, collected, controlled. She recited the list of HOA abuses like a prosecutor reading. Final charges, selective enforcement, document falsification, conflict of interest with a developer, violation of federal environmental law, intimidation of residents, targeted harassment of Mr. Reed, misappropriation of board authority for personal gain. Each point hit like a hammer on glass. Laura's fingers tightened on her clipboard. Her lip trembled. "I tried to protect this community," she shouted. From the back, a mother holding her child called out, "You fined us $200 because my kid's bike was left on the lawn for 10 minutes. A retired teacher. You said my window bookshelf was visual clutter, a man in overalls. You threatened to seize my house over a gnome." And then Tim, my neighbor, soft-spoken, always looking over his shoulder, stood up and said, quietly, "You terrorized us, Laura." There was no applause, just silence. That kind of silence that suffocates noise, that holds grief, and justice, and the beginning of change. Laura's face fell, and in that moment, she looked less like a ruler and more like a ghost of her former self. She turned to me, like maybe, just maybe, I'd stop this. "You don't get it, Reed. Walker promised me something. He said I'd have a future here." I rose to my feet. Every eye turned to me, and I said the words that had been forming for weeks. "Charles Walker did promise you something, Laura, but it wasn't land." The projector came to life. Clara flipped open a laptop, and on screen, the full property map illuminated the room. 2 highlighted lots glowed like neon warnings. "This," I said, pointing to the first, "is my property. The land Laura tried to steal. The land with a permanent conservation easement. And this," I gestured to the second lot, "is Lot 7B, undeveloped, road access, no restrictions. Purchased 8 years ago by a shell company owned by Walker." The crowd leaned in. The permits for development expired 3 days ago. While Laura was busy chasing me, she missed the real opportunity. Her knees nearly buckled, because the truth hit her like a physical blow. Walker had given her a chance. A clean, legal, straightforward chance to build something, to contribute to the community, and she missed it. Because she wanted the shortcut, because she wanted control, because she was too greedy to see the open door right in front of her. "This wasn't about justice," I said, voice steady. "It was about power. And Charles Walker knew you'd choose power every time." Laura's clipboard slipped from her hand. It hit the floor with a soft clack that echoed louder than any gavel. The meeting adjourned minutes later. Laura didn't speak again. She simply walked out, head down, eyes vacant, and she never came back. Within 2 weeks, she sold her house. Her brother's construction company folded under public pressure and permit denials. The HOA board replaced every single enforcement officer. Community guidelines were rewritten, fines slashed. New leadership elected by unanimous vote, and Willow Lake changed. You could feel it. People smiled again. Neighbors spoke without whispering. Kids played in the yards without their parents glancing nervously at the road. Even Tim started leaving his front porch light on at night, like he no longer feared who might come knocking. But it wasn't over for me, because that night, the night Laura left, she came to my door one last time. She didn't threaten. She didn't rage. She just looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "You think you've won? But Walker's last laugh isn't what you think it is." Then she walked away into the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished, that her downfall wasn't the final move, that somewhere buried deep in Walker's plan, one last twist was waiting. The envelope was unmarked, no return address, no stamp, just resting there on my porch bench like it had always belonged. I stood for a moment, staring at it. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the lake behind me was still unnervingly so, like the water was holding its breath. I picked up the envelope, hands suddenly cold despite the warm air. Inside, a letter. Typed, single-spaced, dated 8 years ago, and signed, unmistakably in looping ink, Charles Walker. I didn't sit down. I just started reading. If you're reading this, Oliver, then it means everything went exactly as I planned. Laura took the bait. I felt the blood drain from my face. She always believed the lakefront was her prize, that her will could overwrite the law. But greed always leaves a trail, and people like her always expose themselves if you give them enough rope. The rest of the letter outlined every move, every phase of the trap, the fake community agreement, the expired permits, the conservation easement. Even the architectural flaws built into my cabin, not mistakes, but designed features meant to frustrate anyone trying to flip the property. Walker had spent his final years building a story, one that only I could finish. This isn't just about land, Oliver. It's about legacy. About making sure people like Laura never rise again in this community. About leaving behind a blueprint for resistance. You weren't chosen by accident, you were vetted. Vetted? The word stuck like a splinter. I flipped the page. There were notes about my company, my legal battles, my ethics filings. Interviews Walker had arranged with people I hadn't even realized were vetting me during the purchase. Questions about how I handled pressure, conflict, power. He had picked me, not because I wanted the cabin, because I knew how to fight, and that terrified me, because it meant I had been recruited into something far more complex than property, lines and HOA violations. I folded the letter slowly, heart racing, and then I heard it. A knock. I opened the door before the second one landed. Laura stood there, wild-eyed, hair disheveled, hands shaking. She looked less like a president and more like a fugitive. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely audible. "There's something about the cabin, something Walker never told me, something he left behind." I didn't speak, just stepped aside and let her in. She walked like she was expecting something to explode. "This place," she said, pacing. "It's not just a trap, it's a message, a legacy, but there's something more, something hidden. I remember," he said once, "you'll never find the truth unless you know where to listen. And now I think—" She stopped, looked at me. I think he meant that literally. I stared at her, torn between suspicion and curiosity. "You think there's something in the cabin?" "I know there is," she whispered. "He left something here, and you haven't found it yet." She turned and walked out, leaving those words hanging in the air like a riddle only one man could answer. Walker. That night, I didn't sleep. I tore through the cabin, every floorboard, every beam, every closet. And then, just past 2 a.m., I found it not a safe, not a trapdoor, a panel, hidden beneath a loose plank under the back porch, covered in dirt and time, and beneath it, a box, inside, a cassette tape, labeled in smudged ink for whoever survives her. I stared at it, breathless. There was no recorder in the cabin. I drove into town, found a vintage electronics store, and sat in my car as I pressed play. The voice that crackled out of the speakers was old, slower, but unmistakable. Charles Walker. "Hello, friend. If you found this, then congratulations. You survived. But that doesn't mean it's over." My hand gripped the steering wheel. Laura was never the real danger. She was just the match. There's gasoline under this entire community, a network of corruption she's only one part of. She's connected to more than just her brother's business. She's connected to the original developer of Willow Lake. I blinked. 30 years ago, this land was bought up cheap, divided, and sold under shady terms. Environmental violations, falsified land surveys. They covered it up with phony committees and fake boards. Laura inherited the mask, but not the plan. That's why she was so erratic. She thought she was running the show, but she was just maintaining the illusion. The tape crackled. My cabin, this cabin, sits on the one piece of land they could never control. I made sure of it. Easements, legal barriers, buried records in 3 separate counties. They'll try to dig again now. Now that Laura's failed. The voice dropped lower. Steadier. You've embarrassed her, but you've also attracted attention. And then, almost like prophecy, they'll come for you next. The tape ended in static. I sat in silence, heart thudding, realizing what I had walked into wasn't a personal fight. It was systemic. A chain of greed stretching back decades, rooted in fake land sales, stolen property rights, and corrupt infrastructure, buried beneath cul-de-sacs and fake smiles. Laura wasn't the final boss. She was just the beginning. That same day, Clara called. "Something's off," she said. "We pulled the original blueprints for Willow Lake. There are entire lots that don't exist on county records. Hidden plots, never sold, never taxed." I swallowed hard. "Who owns them?" "That's just it," she said. "We don't know. They're listed under Shellcore with no contact information. And guess what? One of them borders your lot." I walked outside and stood at the edge of my lawn. Beyond the trees, overgrown brush, rocks, vines, lay land no one talked about. Land no one visited. A space that didn't exist officially and yet was real. I stepped into it for the first time, and the ground felt colder, like history had soaked into the soil itself. I turned back to the cabin, to Walker's cabin, and I realized this wasn't just about protecting land, it was about exposing something buried. Laura had cracked open the door, but I was the one who had to walk through it. The deeper I walked into that forgotten lot, the more the woods began to feel wrong. Not dangerous, not haunted, just deliberately left alone. Like someone had planned for it to be ignored. Tall pines grew wild here. Vines coiled like wire around the trunks. The trail wasn't really a trail, just decades of flattened underbrush leading nowhere. But what caught my eye first wasn't the overgrowth. It was the fence. A rusted, warped thing, no higher than my waist, buried behind the brush, like a scar someone had tried to hide. Faded red "No Trespassing" signs dangled crooked on both ends. I ducked under anyway. Clara had sent me coordinates the night before, a satellite view of the area. From above, the land looked like dead space, a blank canvas tucked between surveyed properties. But as I reached the coordinates and looked down at the soil, my stomach turned. A foundation. Not of a house, but a structure, abandoned long ago. Concrete blocks, metal beams, collapsed piping, and burned wood. I stepped. Closer. Something about it felt familiar, not in detail, but in intention. Like someone had built something here and then made a very specific decision to erase it. The way you'd wipe a drive before selling a laptop. Clean, erased, but not gone. Clara met me on site 20 minutes later, hiking boots crunching through. Brush, eyes sharp with disbelief as I pointed at the ruins. "This isn't on any of the community records," she said. "No zoning, no blueprints. But it was something." We started clearing debris, quietly, carefully, and within the hour we found the marker, half buried in mud and leaves, a concrete stamp, barely legible. LDC, Phase 0, Willow Lake Development. Corporation. I looked at Clara. She whispered it before I could. There was a phase before the first phase, and someone had erased it. That night I sat in the cabin staring at the ceiling while the wind howled outside. Charles Walker hadn't just protected land. He'd buried a secret beneath it. Something bigger than Laura's greed. Something older. And far more deliberate. I opened the taped letter again, my hands trembling. If you find what they tried to hide, you'll be walking straight into the storm. But you need to, because only storms uproot rot. The next morning, Clara called. They know you're digging, she said, voice tight. What do you mean? I filed a request at the assessor's office for WLDC's archived plats. 2 hours later, someone from a blocked number called my office and told me to drop it. Just like that. No name, no threat, just drop it. I didn't speak. She continued. There's more. The WLDC was dissolved over 20 years ago, but the registered address leads to a P.O. box that's still active. Guess who signs for it? I held my breath. Laura Kent's mother. I felt the cabin sway, figuratively, but real enough to throw my pulse off. Laura wasn't the start. She was the inheritor. This whole neighborhood was her family's legacy. Not a home, but a scheme. Clara drove back out with 2 new files. One contained old HOA meeting minutes from the early 90s, photocopies from a retired board member who'd kept them in case things ever went bad. They were handwritten, barely legible. But one line jumped off the page. Walker raised concern about Phase 0 site contamination. Board response, silence. The second file was a scanned letter signed by Walker himself. I object to the destruction of protected shoreline for concealed development. If this HOA has become a smokescreen for corporate evasion, I will act accordingly. He knew. He'd known everything from the beginning. Walker had seen the land grab, the zoning fraud, the erasure of Phase 0. And he'd built his cabin as a barrier, not just to preserve the land, but to interrupt the story. Later that day, a black SUV idled near my driveway. I didn't recognize it. No markings, no tags, tinted windows. It stayed parked for 20 minutes. Didn't honk. Didn't move. And then slowly rolled away. The next morning I found my mailbox open. Not damaged, not vandalized. Just open, not empty. There was no mistake. It was a message. I spent the next 48 hours combing every document I had, syncing the GPS data from the destroyed fence site with the Phase 0 foundation, overlaying it with zoning records and survey maps. And then it clicked. Phase 0 wasn't just a hidden development, it was an access point. The destroyed structure had been built where 2 easements intersected, a utility line and an old, undocumented sewer route. The land Laura tried to steal from me, it wasn't valuable just for lake access. It was the final piece of an underground network, a development shortcut buried beneath the HOA paperwork. Clara pieced it together first. They were building without permits, she said. Tapping old utility routes, selling properties based on false infrastructure claims. When Phase 0 was discovered, they destroyed it. Then Walker forced their hand. He bought the critical lot, mine, and he locked it down with the easement. He wasn't just preserving nature. He was sealing off the evidence, and now that Laura had failed, someone else wanted it back. That night, I watched the security feed from my cameras. At 3:14 a.m., a figure walked across my dock. No lights, no tools. Just a slow, deliberate walk to the edge. They stood there for exactly 5 minutes, then turned and walked back into the trees. No damage, no theft, just a message. We see. I sent the footage to Clara. This isn't about HOA anymore, I wrote. It's deeper. Bigger, she replied instantly. Then we go federal. The next day, she filed a formal request with the EPA, the Zoning Commission, and the State Attorney's Office. And I started preparing the final piece of Walker's puzzle, because whatever secret he'd buried beneath this land, it was about to be unearthed. Not by them, by us. 3 weeks after Clara filed the report, the first agent knocked on my door. Not a sheriff, not a county inspector, an EPA special investigator. He introduced himself as Agent Ford, tall, mid-50s, calm voice, sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wore a windbreaker that said Environmental Protection Agency, but his tone had the weight of a federal prosecutor. "We need to talk about the land behind your cabin," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. On the table was everything. The aerial maps, the old HOA letters, the tape from Walker, the scans of Phase Zero's remains. Agent Ford didn't ask me to explain. He just started reading. 15 minutes later, he sat back in the chair and said quietly, "You realize what you've stepped into, right?" "I didn't," I said. "But I do now." He nodded. The Phase Zero site was supposed to be cleaned, up and sealed. There's no record of that ever happening. If they built over contamination and never disclosed it, we're talking about felony violations, fraud, endangerment, maybe even buried toxic waste. I stared at the ground. Walker had been protecting more than aesthetics. He'd been shielding the entire community from a hidden rot. Ford asked to see the spot. I took him down the trail, through the brush, back to the foundation ruins. He photographed everything, collected a soil sample, marked coordinates on a tablet. As we walked back, he said something that chilled me. If Walker hadn't blocked this land, there's a good chance Willow Lake would have become a development disaster. Sinkholes, water contamination, lawsuits, the kind that bankrupt entire towns. And suddenly I understood. Walker didn't just see corruption, he saw consequences. He was a futurist, an engineer, a moral tactician. He didn't fight power with protest. He designed systems to make sure corruption destroyed itself. And I was now part of that system. Ford left with a quiet promise. "You'll be contacted. And when we move hard." Within 5 days, the entire HOA office was served. I watched from the end of the street as federal sedans rolled into the parking lot. EPA teams with gear, clipboards, and enforcement badges. Neighbors stared from their windows. No one spoke. Laura's name wasn't mentioned. She was already gone. But her fingerprints? Everywhere. That same day, Clara called with a voice full of fire. "They're flipping," she said. "Board members, former staff, contractors, everyone's trying to save themselves." And then she paused. "There's one name showing up over and over." "Who?" I asked. "Dale Carson." I froze. Dale Carson was the original head of Willow Lake Development Corp., the one who subdivided the land, the one who disappeared after Phase Zero was completed. But according to federal records, he'd never really left. He was still receiving money, still signing documents, still listed as an active silent partner in HOA budget allocations. Carson hadn't vanished. He'd just hidden himself inside the system. A few days later, I received a certified letter with no return address. Inside, one sheet of paper typed, signed. "We would like to discuss a potential settlement regarding Lot 41 and the surrounding easement land. $1.2 million. Quick sale. No further legal action. Call the number below." No name, no company, just a number. I didn't call it. I handed it to Clara. She did what Clara does best, ran the number through every database imaginable. The phone was registered to an energy consultant in Florida, but that consultant's office didn't exist. It was a forwarding address, redirected 3 times until it led to a corporation. One we knew, Kent Brothers Construction. Laura again, still trying to claw back her piece of the empire. But now, she was desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy. We filed the letter into the evidence log and waited. Meanwhile, Willow Lake began to change. The board had resigned. A new interim team, made up of actual community members, was elected by emergency vote. Tim was among them, nominated by a neighbor, seconded by 3 others before he could object. His first motion? Suspend all HOA violations pending federal review. His second? Request a public community hearing about Phase 0. Clara and I helped organize. We printed everything: Walker's letters, a visual timeline, soil reports, deed transfers, falsified plats. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. People came in droves. It wasn't just neighbors anymore. Reporters, lawyers, environmental advocates. Even families from nearby neighborhoods who'd heard about the Willow Lake scandal and wanted to understand what the hell had happened here. I stood off to the side as Clara took the mic and presented the case. Her voice was steady, her delivery surgical. She showed the community how the HOA had weaponized bureaucracy, how WLDC had buried Phase 0 under fake filings, how Laura Kent and those before her had preserved power not to protect the neighborhood, but to hide a history of environmental fraud and corporate greed. And then she revealed what none of them had known: that the land they walked on, the land they trusted, was one mistake away from collapse. Walker didn't just preserve the lake, Clara said. He protected you. Every single person here owes their clean water, their safe homes, their property value, to a man who chose to fight quietly, elegantly, strategically. And then she turned to me, and to the man who finished what he started. The room went silent, and then they stood. Applause, cheering. Tim hugged me. Mrs. Patterson wept quietly. For the first time since this all began, I felt peace. Not because the battle was over, but because the truth had been heard. Later that night, I returned to the cabin. The wind off the lake was strong. I poured a glass of whiskey and stood on the deck, looking out over the water. Walker's letter sat open beside me. I read the final lines again. If the truth ever finds light, you'll know what to do next. They'll try to spin it, rewrite it, erase it again. Don't let them. Truth is only permanent if someone guards it. And I realized something. This wasn't a victory story. This was an inheritance. Walker had given me more than land. He'd given me a torch. And it was my job to keep it lit. It had been 2 months since the hearing. The air in Willow Lake felt different now, lighter. Doors stayed open. Sidewalks buzzed with conversation instead of whispers. Kids rode bikes past houses once watched like prison towers. And Mrs. Patterson started planting flowers in her front yard again. Yellow ones. For the first time, the color didn't trigger a violation. The board was rebuilding from the ground up. Tim and 2 other neighbors had drafted a new charter, focused on transparency, resident rights, and community consent. They removed arbitrary fines, eliminated the vague aesthetic standards, and started organizing real neighborhood events. It was peaceful. Earned peace. But peace always has a shadow. The federal investigation wasn't over. Agent Ford had gone, quiet, which Clara assured me was a good sign. "They don't talk until they're ready to charge someone," she'd said, flipping through a thick stack of sealed subpoenas. The last time I saw Laura Kent was through a TV screen. Local news had caught her leaving a courthouse in another state, ducking into a car. No charges announced, not yet, but whispers were spreading. Tax fraud, environmental negligence, conspiracy to defraud. She looked smaller on camera, thinner, tired, but her eyes still burned with blame. And somehow, I knew she didn't see herself as the villain. To her, this was all still a misunderstanding, a legacy stolen by an outsider who didn't understand how things work. She was wrong. I understood now better than anyone, because the closer I looked at Walker's legacy, the more I saw how intentional every step had been. He hadn't just protected land, he'd protected people. From greed, from decay, from the rot that hides behind respectable paperwork. The easement, the structure, the letter, the cassette. But there was one final thing Walker left behind. One last envelope. Clara found it, buried in county archives. A private letter, sealed and labeled. To be opened only if Willow Lake is audited. And now it was. The letter wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to the community. So we held a final meeting, not in the HOA office, not under fluorescent lights, but out on the grass behind the community center, where the lake shimmered like it was listening. I stood in front of the gathered crowd, some sitting in lawn chairs, others leaning on railings or tree trunks. And I read Walker's last words aloud. "To those who choose to stay, I built this place with the hope it would shelter more than just houses. I dreamed of a community that knew itself, protected itself, and held power accountable, even when that power wore a friendly smile. You've seen now what happens when one person is given too much. You've seen how rules can become weapons. But more importantly, you've seen how they can be reclaimed. If this letter is being read, it means the mask has fallen. And that means you've already won the first battle. But only the first. I urge you now, do not forget. Document everything. Question everyone. Trust slow progress, not quick promises. Power grows quietly. But so does resistance. I'm just a man who loved a lake. You are the ones who must keep it alive." By the time I finished, half the crowd was crying. Even the kids stayed silent. And somewhere in the trees behind me, the wind picked up just enough to rustle the branches. Not enough to be loud, but enough to feel, like the trees were exhaling. That evening I sat alone on the deck of the cabin. The water below was glass. The sun dipped behind the trees, scattering light across the lake like broken amber. And I opened my laptop. For months I had recorded every step of this journey, not just for legal purposes, not for evidence, but for memory. Now, I began turning it into something else, not a case study, not a news article, a record, a digital time capsule. Photos, documents, Walker's voice, board minutes, satellite scans, maps, blueprints, a searchable archive of truth, the kind of thing that couldn't be silenced or buried again. Clara helped host it. Tim helped promote it. We called it the Willow Ledger. And as the site went live, we watched as the visitor count ticked up. Slowly at first, then hundreds, then thousands. Other communities started reaching out, other stories, other battles. Walker had lit the match here, but he'd built it to burn brighter, and I, a man who just wanted peace, had become the keeper of the flame. Weeks later, I received one final envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a photo, a black and white shot of Phase 0, under construction decades ago. Men standing in hard hats, equipment in the background. In the middle, a young Charles Walker on the back in his handwriting. They never knew I was watching them, but I always was. I framed it, hung it by the front door of the cabin, not as a warning, as a reminder. That vigilance doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be constant. Some nights now, I still sit on the deck, staring out at the lake, drink in hand, eyes heavy, with everything this place has taught me. And I swear, when the water is still and the stars line up just right, I can hear him laughing. Charles Walker, the quiet architect of a resistance no one saw coming, the man who weaponized patience, the man who used a cabin to bring down an empire. And every time the wind picks up through the trees, soft, measured, deliberate, I nod and raise my glass. To justice. To community. To the man who proved that sometimes the loudest echo comes from silence.